Celia Lawson had buried a husband, rebuilt a homestead from scorched earth, and taught herself to shoe a horse by the age of 26. So when the women of Caldwell Creek told her she ought to find herself a new man, she smiled with all the warmth of a January window and said she had no use for romance. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas plains had turned the particular shade of green that made a person believe, just for a moment, that the land itself was promising something. Celia did not trust promises from men or from earth, but she did trust the weight of her ledger book, the reliability of her well, and the 300 acres of wheat that were beginning to push through the soil like small green arguments against hopelessness. She had purchased the land herself, negotiated the deed in her own name at a time when the county clerk had looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language, and she had walked out of that office with the paper folded against her chest, feeling more married to those 300 acres than she had ever felt to Thomas Lawson. God rest his troubled soul. Thomas had been a dreamer, which Celia had once found charming and had later come to understand as a more poetic word for unreliable. He had died in the winter of 1880, not from anything dramatic like a gunfight or a cattle stampede, but from a fever that crept into his lungs after he spent 3 November nights sleeping in a wet camp rather than coming home when the storm came in. Even in dying, Thomas had been impractical. Celia had mourned him properly, had worn black for the correct number of months, had cried twice in private and never in public, and then she had rolled up her sleeves and made herself into the kind of woman the land respected. Caldwell Creek was a small cattle town on the edge of the Kishom Trail, which meant that between March and October it smelled like cattle and ambition, and between November and February it smelled like wood smoke and survival. The town had a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, a saloon called the Lucky Hammer that Celia had entered exactly twice on matters of business, a church with a leaking roof that the congregation had been planning to repair for 3 years, and a sheriff named Dodd who was decent enough but fond of his pipe tobacco to a degree that made his attention somewhat selective. There was also a land office, a small telegraph station, a blacksmith's forge, and a schoolhouse where Celia occasionally helped when the schoolteacher, a thin young woman named Miss Farley, had too many students to manage alone. Into this town, on a bright Tuesday in April of 1882, rode Amos Easton. He came in from the south on a roan horse that looked like it had covered serious distance but still held itself with a kind of working dignity, the same way its rider did. Celia saw him first from the window of Mrs. Prout's general store, where she had gone to collect a spool of wire and a sack of cornmeal. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a battered hat that had clearly been rained on many times and had survived each occasion by developing character rather than elegance. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers tucked into boots that were well made but not new. There were no silver spurs, no decorative anything. He did not look like a man who spent money on looking like a man. He guided his horse to the hitching post outside the land office with the quiet efficiency of someone who had arrived at a great many places and knew how to get settled without announcing himself. "Who is that?" said Mrs. Prout from behind the counter, craning her neck in a way that made her silver hair list to one side. "I couldn't say," Celia said, and returned her attention to comparing 2 spools of wire with the focused interest of someone who genuinely cared about wire. She did not think about him again until the following Thursday, when she was in the middle of negotiating a repair to her fence line along the north pasture, and discovered that the new section of property adjacent to hers, which had been vacant since old Harlan Greer died without any living relatives to claim it, had been purchased. She knew this because there was a man on the other side of the fence line, walking it the same way she was walking it, checking every post with his hands, testing each wire with a practiced tug. They reached the corner post at approximately the same moment. He stopped. She stopped. He took off his hat, and she saw that he had brown eyes and a face that looked like it had spent serious time outdoors doing serious work, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun rather than from laughing too much, though there was something around his mouth that suggested he was not entirely a stranger to amusement. "Amos Easton," he said. "I bought the Greer place." "Celia Lawson," she said. "I own everything on this side of the line." He looked at the fence with a serious expression. "This corner post is leaning about 3 inches east." "I know," she said. "I was assessing whether it needed to come out entirely or whether it could be reset." "Needs to come out," he said. "The wood's rotted at the base. You can see where the moisture has been sitting." Celia looked more carefully. He was right, which was an annoying thing to have confirmed. "I'll have it out by Saturday," she said. "I could help," he said. "I'll need to reset my side of the line anyway. Makes sense to do both at once." She studied him the way she studied any business arrangement, looking for the angle, the thing that would cost her more than it seemed. He met her look without flinching, without performing anything, just waited like a man comfortable with being evaluated. "6 in the morning," she said. "Bring your own tools." "Yes, ma'am," he said, put his hat back on and walked away. She watched him go for exactly 3 seconds, then went back to examining her fence line. He was there at 6 in the morning on Saturday. Not 6:15, not 5:55 to seem eager. 6, with a post-hole digger, a sledgehammer, and a canvas roll of tools that indicated a person who had assembled their equipment thoughtfully over time. Celia already had her own tools out and coffee on the fire in an iron pot, because she had been up since 4:30 as she always was, and she did not think twice about pouring him a cup when he arrived, because it was practical, not hospitable. He drank it without comment on its quality, which was good because it was strong enough to wake the dead, and they got to work. Working beside a person told you things about them that conversation took much longer to reveal. Amos Easton, Celia learned in the first 2 hours of that Saturday, did not waste motion. He thought before he acted, which meant he acted correctly most of the time and did not have to undo his own mistakes. He did not fill silence with noise. He did not try to manage or redirect her work. When she made a decision about how to approach a section of fence, he incorporated that decision into his approach without discussion, and when he made a decision about his side, he did it cleanly and without making it a statement about his competence. By noon, they had reset 4 posts and restretched 2 sections of wire. "You've done fence work before," she said. It was not a question. "Been working ranches since I was 18, he said. "Started in Texas. Moved north when the work shifted." "How old are you now?" she asked, because she was practical and age was a practical piece of information. 29, he said. "You?" 26, she said. "Why did you buy land instead of hiring on somewhere?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding an answer, but the silence of someone finding the right one. "I've spent 11 years making other men's land work," he said. "I wanted to make something that was mine. Something that would still be there because I built it right, not because someone else decided to keep me on." She understood that with a clarity that surprised her, because it was almost exactly the thing she would have said if someone had asked her the same question. She did not say so. They ate lunch separately, which was reasonable, and then worked through the afternoon until the light began to soften and the shadow of the fence line stretched long across both their fields. When they were done, Celia looked at the work and found it sound. The posts were plumb and solid. The wire was taut. The corner was correct. "Good work," she said, which was the highest compliment she had available. "You too," he said, gathering his tools. She expected him to say something else, to angle toward some kind of social continuation, because that was what men usually did, but he didn't. He rolled his canvas tool wrap, picked up his sledgehammer, and said, "I'll need to work the east side of my property next weekend. Different project, but if you're working your east line, I'm happy to coordinate again." "I'll see what my schedule is," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and walked back toward the Greer place. Celia stood in her field for a moment, looking at the repaired fence. She felt something that she identified, after a brief examination, as professional respect, which was a perfectly sensible thing to feel about a competent neighbor and nothing more. Over the following weeks, the coordination became something of a pattern. It was entirely practical, Celia told herself each time. Amos was rebuilding the Greer place from nearly nothing, because old Harlan had let things decline considerably in his last years, and the tasks that benefited from two sets of hands were numerous. Celia had her own projects that moved faster with help. They traded labor in a businesslike fashion, keeping a mental accounting of effort that stayed roughly balanced, and they worked side by side with the comfort of people who had figured out each other's rhythms without having to discuss them. He was rebuilding the barn when he discovered that the east wall had been built on ground that had settled unevenly, and the whole structure was at risk of leaning itself into the ground within a few more years. He showed her the problem with the quiet frustration of someone who had been expecting it but had still hoped to be wrong. "The footing has to come out," she said, crouching to look at the base logs. "You'll need to jack the wall, dig out the old foundation, and reset it. It's a week's work at least." "I know," he said. "I've done it once before on a place in Colorado. It's not impossible." "It's not," she agreed. "I'll help. I have the jacks." He looked at her. "That's a significant contribution." "I'll need your labor in return when I start on my irrigation channel," she said. "I'm planning to run water from the creek to the north field, digging mostly." "That's more than fair," he said. They worked on the barn wall for 6 days, and by the end Celia knew, in the way she knew things about the weather and the soil and the structural integrity of timber, that Amos Easton was an exceptionally rare kind of person. He had opinions, but he did not have the need to impose them. He had skills, but he did not perform them. He worked until the work was done, not until his pride was satisfied. And when he made a mistake, which everyone did, he noted it, corrected it, and did not dwell. On the 6th day, when the wall was set and they were cleaning up in the last hour of evening light, she caught herself looking at him for a moment longer than was required by practical purposes. He was washing his hands in the bucket by the barn door, his hat pushed back on his head, and he was smiling at something in the middle distance, some private satisfaction at the work completed. She looked away immediately and made herself very busy with organizing a stack of planks that did not particularly need organizing. The women of Caldwell Creek had opinions about this arrangement. Mrs. Prout delivered them in the guise of conversation. "People are saying you and the Easton man are working very closely together," she said one afternoon while she measured out Celia's sugar. "We're neighbors," Celia said. "In this county, neighbors cooperate. It's how things get done." "Yes, but there's cooperative, and then there's spending nearly every Saturday working on each other's land," Mrs. Prout said, managing to make this observation sound both factual and weighted with significant implication. "Mrs. Prout," Celia said pleasantly, "does the sugar come in the 2-pound portion, or is that the price for the pound?" Mrs. Prout returned to the matter of sugar. The church social in June was an annual event in Caldwell Creek, hosted in the churchyard when the weather was good enough, which it was that year. Everyone came, because in a town of 200 people there was no such thing as opting out of community events without commentary. Celia came because she always came. She brought a pie, because bringing food to a community gathering was practical. She wore her good green dress, because it was a social occasion and she was not an animal, but she wore her hair in its usual practical arrangement because doing elaborate things with her hair required more patience than the occasion warranted. Amos Easton came in his good shirt, which was a dark blue and appeared to have been pressed that morning. He had combed his hair. He looked, Celia thought before she stopped herself from thinking it, quite good. He found her within the first 15 minutes, not in a seeking way but in the way of a person who knows where to stand to find familiar ground in an unfamiliar social situation, and they spent a portion of the evening standing in comfortable proximity, speaking when they had something to say and not speaking when they didn't, while the rest of the town moved around them in the elaborate choreography of small community gatherings. Reverend Aldrich's wife, A cheerful woman named Nan, who had the social instincts of a bird dog, appeared beside them with a plate of biscuits and the transparent intention of facilitating conversation between them. "Isn't it lovely that Celia has such a capable neighbor?" she said. "She's been working so hard out there on her own." "She has," Amos said, without any of the condescension that the word alone might have carried from someone else. "She's transformed that north pasture since March. It's impressive work." Celia looked at him. He said it the same way he said anything, matter-of-factly, and he was looking at Nan Aldrich and not at Celia, which meant he was not saying it for her benefit. He was just saying what he thought was true. She found this unexpectedly disarming. She took a biscuit and removed herself from the situation by engaging Mrs. Farley in a conversation about the schoolhouse roof, which needed the same attention that the church roof needed, and which was a practical topic that required no navigation. Later, when the sun had gone down and people had lit the yard lanterns and someone with a fiddle had started playing in a way that made people's feet move without permission, Amos appeared beside her again. He was holding 2 cups of lemonade and extended one toward her. She took it. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I know how," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was watching the dancing with an expression that was not particularly romantic or eager, just curious, the same expression he brought to everything. "I don't usually," she said. "I find it impractical." "Dancing," he said with a note of genuine interest. "How so?" "It accomplishes nothing," she said. "You expend energy moving in circles and end up where you started." He was quiet for a moment and she thought he might argue with her, but instead he said, "That's fair," and sipped his lemonade. She was almost disappointed. "You're not going to defend it," she said. He turned his head to look at her. In the lantern light, his brown eyes had warmth in them that she had not noticed before, or possibly had been avoiding noticing. "I didn't say I agreed with you," he said. "I said it was fair. You're entitled to your opinion about dancing." "But you think I'm wrong," she said. "I think you're practical," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it sound like an observation rather than a criticism, layered over with something else that she could not quite identify. "I think that's served you well. I think it sometimes costs a thing or two." She looked back at the dancers. "Everything has a cost," she said. "The question is whether the return justifies it." "Sometimes the return isn't something you can put in a ledger," he said. She had no answer to that, which was unusual, and so she said nothing, and they stood together in the lantern light drinking their lemonade while the fiddle played something that was both mournful and joyful in the specific way that music in the West could be, containing the whole truth of the place in 3 minutes of sound. The irrigation channel project began in July, and true to his word, Amos was there for every day of the digging. It was hard, grinding work. 600 feet of channel from the creek bank to the north field, through ground that was mostly cooperative but had its difficult stretches of clay and rock that had to be addressed with pick and patience. They hired 2 additional men from town for the heaviest stretches, brothers named Cal and Henry Ford, who were reliable workers and known to Celia from previous projects, and the 4 of them dug and lined and graded through the heat of July with the systematic determination of people who had a plan and were executing it. On the 10th day, they hit a shelf of limestone about 2 feet down that ran through a 30-foot section of the planned route. Celia looked at it for a long time. Amos crouched beside the trench and looked at it too. "We can go around it," he said. "Adds about 40 feet to the channel length, but the grade still works if we adjust here and here." He indicated 2 points in the existing channel where the angle could be modified. "Show me the numbers," she said. He had a piece of paper and a pencil in his shirt pocket, which she had noticed he always carried, and he sketched it out on the paper, crouched in the July dust, while she crouched beside him and looked at the sketch. He smelled like hard work and something like cedar, which was a completely irrelevant observation that she filed away in the place where she put irrelevant observations. His calculations were sound. The grade would work. "All right," she said. "We adjust." "We adjust," he agreed and stood and called to Cal and Henry about the change of plan. By August, the channel was complete, and water was running from the creek to the north field in a controlled, steady flow that would change the yield of that field permanently and substantially. Celia stood at the point where the water entered the field on the first morning it ran, watching the shallow silver line trace its way across the soil, and she felt something so large and wordless that she had to press her lips together to keep it contained. Amos stood beside her. He had come to see it working, which she had neither invited nor discouraged. He was quiet for a long time, watching the water move. "You did that," he said finally. "We did it," she said. "Your plan," he said. "Your land. Your vision for what it could be. We just dug the hole." She turned to look at him, intending to say something sensible about the collaborative nature of the project, and she found that he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was direct and still and had something in it that she recognized, because she had read about it in novels she was not going to admit to reading, something that had the quality of a door opening rather than being pushed. She looked back at the water. "It's a good channel," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." The summer moved into fall the way it always did on the plains, with the particular urgency of a season that knew its time was limited. Celia was busy with harvest, and Amos was busy with his own preparations for winter, and they saw each other less frequently, but the awareness of his presence on the neighboring property had become something she simply lived with, the way she lived with the sound of the creek and the smell of the wheat fields and the weight of the sky on clear days. In September, there was trouble. It came in the form of a man named Rennick, a land speculator from back east who had been buying up parcels in the county by various methods, some of them legal and some of them occupying an interesting gray area between legal and not. He had approached Celia twice in the spring with offers on her land that she had declined with increasing directness, and she had not thought much about him afterward because she had a deed and a lawyer in Wichita who was competent, and she had no reason to fear a man with money and a smooth manner. The trouble was that Rennick had apparently decided to approach the matter differently. He had found a clerk at the county seat who was willing, for a fee, to create a document suggesting that Thomas Lawson had taken out a substantial loan against the property before his death, a loan that Celia had never known about because it did not exist, but that now appeared in certain county records with dates and signatures that were plausible enough to cause a problem. The first Celia knew of it was when a man from the county land office arrived at her door on a Thursday morning with a piece of paper that made her blood go cold. She read it twice. Then she sat down at her kitchen table and read it a third time, because she was practical and practical people made sure they understood the problem before they addressed it. What it said was that the Lawson property carried a lien of $1,200, recorded in Thomas Lawson's name, to a lending entity associated with Rennick's business interests. The document had been registered 2 months before Thomas died. If the lien was valid, and if it had been accumulated to the current interest, it represented a sum that Celia could not pay without selling land, which she was not going to do. She thanked the man from the land office with a calm she did not feel, closed her door, and stood in her kitchen for approximately 2 minutes, allowing herself to be afraid. Then she put on her good boots and rode to town. She went to the telegraph station first and sent a wire to her lawyer in Wichita. Then she went to Sheriff Dodd's office and explained the situation clearly and without embellishment. Dodd listened, lit his pipe at least 3 times during the conversation because he was nervous, and said he would look into the records at the county seat. When she came out of the sheriff's office, Amos was there. He was not waiting for her. He had been at the general store and had seen her ride in with the kind of posture that indicated purpose rather than errands, and he had waited because it was not a thing he could explain except that when Celia Lawson rode into town looking like that, it seemed reasonable to be available. "There's a problem," she said. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Standing on the wooden sidewalk outside the sheriff's office in the September sun, with the street life of Caldwell Creek moving around them, She explained the situation with the clarity and precision she brought to all things, and he listened with the attentiveness that she had come to understand was simply the way he listened to everything, as though what you said mattered enough to be heard correctly. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The document is false," he said. It was not a question. "I kept every record Thomas ever had," she said. "Every receipt, every letter of credit, every agreement he made. I have them in a tin box under my floor. There is no loan." "I would have known." "Then there will be a way to prove it," he said. "Yes," she said, "there will be. It may take time." He looked at her with the same directness he had offered that morning by the irrigation channel, steady and clear. "In the meantime," he said, "is there anything you need?" "My lawyer will come from Wichita," she said, "probably next week. Until then, I need to gather every document I have and organize them in a way that makes the case clearly." "I can help with that," he said. "It's paperwork," she said, "sorting and cataloging." "I can read and sort," he said, with something that was almost a smile. She looked at him for a moment, and the practical part of her brain said that help was help and this was a matter of urgency, and the other part of her brain, the part she usually kept from having opinions, said something wordless but vivid that she ignored entirely. "Come by tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring your pencil." He smiled then, fully and briefly, and she turned and walked to her horse before she could do anything foolish like smile back. They spent 2 days sorting documents at her kitchen table. It was exactly as unromantic as paperwork sounds, and also somehow not. The tin box had yielded an astonishing quantity of paper, because Celia had kept every document connected to the property going back to its original purchase by Thomas 6 years prior, and organizing them into a coherent legal argument required both patience and a certain logical intelligence that Amos turned out to have in considerable quantity. He was good with dates. He could hold multiple timelines in his head simultaneously and flag inconsistencies. When they found a receipt for the specific piece of equipment that Rennick's false document claimed Thomas had purchased with the loan money, dated 18 months before the supposed loan was made, Amos set it aside with a quiet sound of satisfaction and said, "That's one nail." Celia looked at the receipt. "He bought that harrow with cash from his cattle sale in the spring of 1879. I have the cattle sale record too." "Where is it?" She found it in 30 seconds because she had organized the cattle records chronologically on the left side of the table, and Amos took both documents and set them together in the pile that was growing into an argument against the false lien with the persuasive weight of simple truth. On the second afternoon, working through the last box, he found Thomas's diary. It was a plain leather notebook with Thomas's handwriting in it, irregular and large, the handwriting of a man who wrote when he felt like it. Celia had not looked at it since the month after Thomas died. Amos held it up. "Should I go through this?" She looked at it for a moment. "Yes," she said. "If there's any reference to finances in the period around the supposed loan date, it would be useful." He opened it carefully and read while she continued sorting. She heard him turn pages, heard him stop at certain passages, heard the particular quality of silence that meant he was reading something that mattered. After a while he said, without looking up, "He wrote a great deal about you." She stopped sorting. "He was sentimental," she said, and then, because she was not going to be dishonest with herself even when it would have been more comfortable, she said, "Thomas had a great capacity for love. He was not always practical about how he expressed it." "He wrote that you were the best thing he ever did," Amos said quietly. She was quiet for a moment. "Did he write anything about the finances in 1880? She said. Amos turned a few more pages. "Yes," he said. "Here, March of 1880. He wrote about the decision not to take the bank's offered credit for the fence expansion. He wrote that you had decided to wait until the cattle money came in and do it without debt. He wrote that this was wise." He paused. "He referred to himself as impractical and wrote that he was grateful you were not." Celia pressed her hands flat on the table. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the wheat stubble in the south field with a sound like rushing water. "Is there anything else useful for the period?" she said. "I'll keep looking," he said gently, and did not make her look at the diary herself, which was a kindness she had not asked for and did not know how to respond to except by continuing to sort the papers with unimpeachable efficiency. Her lawyer arrived from Wichita the following Thursday. He was a precise man named Mr. Bauer who wore good suits and had a memory for legal precedent that Celia had cause to be grateful for several times. He went through the documents they had organized for 2 hours, asked specific questions, and by the end of the afternoon his expression had settled from cautious to something approaching confident. "This is manageable," he said. "The documentation is clear, and more importantly, the county records on the opposing document show characteristics of a type that can be challenged. I've seen this method before. It's not subtle, and it generally doesn't survive scrutiny from someone who knows what to look for." "How long?" Celia asked. 2 months, possibly 3, he said. "There will be a hearing, you'll need to be present." "I will be," she said. Amos stayed for dinner that evening, which was the first time they had shared a meal that was not food eaten while working, and it was not complicated or remarkable in itself. Just bread and beans, and the remainder of a chicken she had roasted 2 days before, eaten at the kitchen table with Mr. Bauer, who turned out to have opinions about the cattle market that Amos engaged with competently, and at length while Celia listened and felt, in a way she found slightly alarming, something that was the emotional equivalent of a structural foundation, solid, undemonstrative, and necessary. When Mr. Bauer had retired to the spare room and the table was cleared, Amos stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and said, "It's going to be all right." "Yes," she said, "it is." "You knew that already," he said. "I was fairly certain," she said. "Having the certainty confirmed is still useful." He turned his hat in his hands once, which was the only fidgeting she had ever seen from him. "Celia," he said. She looked at him. "I don't want to make things complicated," he said. "We've built something here that works, a good working arrangement, and I value it. But," she said, because there was clearly a but and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "But I'd be lying if I said it was only that," he said, and his voice was steady and factual, the same voice he used to describe problems with fence posts and soil gradation, which somehow made it more sincere rather than less. "I don't have any interest in romance for its own sake. I'm not a man who's going to write poetry or say pretty things, but I have a very strong interest in you, and it's the kind that doesn't seem inclined to go away." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the kitchen table was burning steadily, and outside the wind had died down, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made a sound that was both lonely and matter-of-fact. "I'm too practical for romance," she said. "I told that to enough people in this town that it's more or less my established position." "Good," he said, without missing a beat. "So is forever." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, it was not that. She looked at his face, and his expression was completely serious, completely clear, the expression of a man who had said a thing because he meant it and had no particular investment in how it landed as long as it was understood correctly. "You're proposing forever as a practical matter," she said. "I'm saying that forever is the most practical arrangement 2 people can make," he said. "If you're building something meant to last, you commit the materials for the duration. You don't do the foundation and hope the structure stays up." "That's an extremely unromantic way to talk about marriage," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. Thomas had been romantic, had brought her wildflowers and written her letters full of feeling, and she had loved him for it even as she sometimes wished he would fix the roof instead. Amos had fixed her corner post, dug her irrigation channel, sorted her legal documents. He showed up at 6 in the morning with his tools and his pencil and his attention, and he stayed for the duration of every project she had ever undertaken with him. "No," she said quietly, "it doesn't bother me." "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm just saying what's true so you know where I stand." "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and said good night with the calm of a man who had done the thing he needed to do and was at peace with the outcome, whatever it was. She closed the door behind him and stood in her kitchen for a while, not thinking about him in a dreaming way, but thinking about him the way she thought about everything she was trying to understand correctly, turning the information in her hands, looking at it from different angles. The following morning she was in the south field checking the late wheat when he came across from his property with 2 cups of coffee, which was the first time he had ever done that. He handed her one without comment, and she took it, and they stood in the field in the pale early light looking at the wheat, and she thought that this was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing she could live with indefinitely. "You're not going to make me wait long, are you?" he said, after about 5 minutes of companionable silence. He said it without anxiety, just with the practical interest of someone with a project timeline to consider. She looked at him. Something in her chest had been rearranging itself quietly for months without her permission, and she had been ignoring it with the focused determination of a woman who was too practical for romance. But Amos Easton had not, it turned out, offered her romance. He had offered her something better: presence, competence, honesty, and permanence. "No," she said, "I'm not." He turned to look at her, and what was in his face was not triumph or relief or any of the theatrical emotions that novels had led her to expect. It was simply satisfaction, the deep, quiet kind that came from a thing being right. "Good," he said, and drank his coffee. "We'll need to talk about the practical arrangement," she said. "The land is mine, the deed is in my name, and it will stay that way." "Obviously," he said, "and mine stays in mine." "2 separate properties," she said, "with 1 household." "That's a sensible structure," he said. "I'm not going to change my name," she said. "Celia Lawson owns this land. That's a legal and historical fact." He looked at her. "I wouldn't ask you to." "Some men would," she said. "I'm not some men," he said. She looked at the wheat for a moment. "No," she said, "you're not." They were married in November in the church with the leaking roof by Reverend Aldrich, in front of what seemed to be most of Caldwell Creek, and also Mr. Bauer from Wichita, who had stayed because he liked the town more than he had expected, and also because the hearing on the Rennick matter was still pending and he wanted to be useful. Celia wore her green dress because it was the best dress she had, and she carried no flowers because she had not thought to. And then at the last moment Mrs. Pruitt pressed a small bunch of late-season prairie flowers into her hands with an expression of such determined benevolence that Celia accepted them without comment. Amos stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and when she reached him he said, low enough for only her to hear, "You look like yourself." "Is that good?" she asked. "It's the best thing you could look like," he said. Reverend Aldrich said the words, and they said the words back, and Celia Lawson married Amos Easton with full awareness of what she was doing, which was both a practical arrangement and the most important decision she had ever made, and she held both of those truths in the same hand without any contradiction between them. Mrs. Nan Aldrich cried, as she cried at every wedding, and Mrs. Pruitt made a sound that was technically not crying but was in the same neighborhood, and Cal and Henry Ford, who had come because they considered themselves connected to Celia's enterprise in a meaningful way, stood in the back and looked approving. The hearing on the Rennick lien was held in December at the county courthouse in Wellington, the county seat, and Celia attended it in her good boots and a coat she had borrowed from Mrs. Pruitt because it was dignified. Amos came with her, and Mr. Bauer met them there with the organized documents and the expression of a man who had done this before and knew how it was going to go. It went exactly as it was going to go. Mr. Bauer presented the contradicting evidence. He brought to the court's attention the specific characteristics of the recording that indicated the document had been created after the date it claimed, based on the ink composition and the registration numbering sequence. He brought Thomas's diary entries and the receipts for the harrow and the cattle sale record. He also brought a statement from a former employee of Rennick's Land Company, a young man who had left the company 4 months ago with a grievance, and that statement was the most useful piece of evidence in the room. The judge was a weathered man named Cowboy who had been sitting on cases in that county for 12 years, and had a manner that suggested he had seen every version of this kind of scheme and was tired of all of them. He listened to both sides, asked a number of pointed questions that made the attorney representing Rennick's interests visibly uncomfortable, reviewed the documentary evidence, and dismissed the lien entirely. He also referred the matter of the falsified recording to the county attorney, because creating fraudulent land records was a serious matter, and because Judge Calloway was not a man who was going to let that slide simply because the parties involved were done with each other. Rennick left Caldwell Creek County by the end of January. The county clerk who had assisted him was removed from his position and faced legal consequences, which Celia understood with clear eyes to be both justice and a deterrent, and she had no particular interest in savoring it but did note it as a fact. Standing outside the courthouse after the hearing, in December air that was cold enough to make the horses impatient, Amos took her gloved hand in his and said nothing, and she leaned against his shoulder for exactly 10 seconds, which was more public sentiment than she usually permitted herself, and then stood straight and said, "We should get back before dark." "We should," he said, and his hand was warm around hers even through both their gloves, and he did not make anything of the 10 seconds, which was precisely correct. The winter was a good one for working in close quarters. The farmhouse that Celia had built up slowly from Thomas's original structure was warm and solid, with a kitchen that had good light and enough space to work at the table without feeling crowded. Amos moved his belongings into it with the same efficiency he brought to physical labor, taking up exactly the space he needed and no more, making room for himself within her established order without disrupting it in the ways that mattered. He had opinions about the kitchen, which he expressed once and then dropped when she declined to implement them, and she had opinions about his tool organization in the barn, which she expressed once and then dropped when he indicated he had a system. They navigated these things with the practical good sense of people who had already demonstrated they could work together without ego, and by February the household ran with a combined efficiency that was, Celia had to admit privately, rather better than either of them had managed alone. He got up at 4:30 in the morning because she did. She came to understand the particular quality of his silence at the end of a difficult day, when he had hit a problem that he was still working through in his head, and she left him to it in the same way he had always left her to her own processing. They played chess in the evenings with a battered set that had belonged to Thomas, and Amos won about 60% of the time and lost about 40%, and Celia was fairly certain that ratio was not coincidental on his part, though she never raised the point because she could not be entirely sure, and it was not worth creating a controversy over a chess board. In March, 2 pieces of news arrived at roughly the same time. The first was from Amos's younger sister, who lived with her husband in a settlement in the Indian Territory to the south, and who wrote to say that their brother, a man named Frank who had been working cattle further west, had been badly injured in an accident and was in poor condition. The second was that Celia was pregnant. She told Amos about the pregnancy first, on a Tuesday evening after dinner, in the same direct way she told him everything. She watched his face go through a journey in about 4 seconds, from ordinary to something so undefended and immediate that she felt it in her own chest. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and did something he very rarely did in unprompted moments, which was take her face in his hands, gently, and look at her with everything he had without any of the usual carefully maintained steadiness. "Celia," he said, and stopped, and clearly could not find a way to put whatever he was feeling into words practical enough for him to say out loud. "I know," she said. He sat down beside her rather than across from her, which was also unusual, and they sat together at the table for a while, which was enough. Then she told him about the letter regarding Frank. He read it with a different expression, the expression of someone receiving difficult information and organizing a response to it. "I need to go see him," he said. "I know," she said. "That's a long way. It's a week's travel at least." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm also aware that the weather is still uncertain in March, that the Indian Territory has its own conditions and considerations, and that you should take the good horse and at least 2 weeks' worth of provisions." He looked at her. "I don't want to leave you. I'm 13 weeks pregnant," she said. "I'm not incapacitated. I managed this land for 2 years by myself." "That's not why I don't want to leave," he said. She looked at him, and there was something in his expression that she had learned to read by now, the thing under his usual plainness that was the deep current of what he felt. She reached across and put her hand over his on the table. "Go see your brother," she said. "I will be here when you come back. I am not going anywhere." He put his other hand over hers. "I know," he said, in a voice that was lower than usual. "That's the thing I'm most certain of." He left 3 days later, having made arrangements with Cal Ford to check on Celia's property every few days, and with Mrs. Prout to look in on Celia herself. Celia accepted these arrangements with moderate grace, managing not to point out that she was capable of looking in on herself, because she could see that making the arrangements was Amos's way of doing something useful with the worry he was carrying, and usefulness was his primary language. He kissed her goodbye at the door in the early morning, and she felt the solidity of him, the familiar specific weight and warmth, and she held it long enough to be sure of it, and then she stepped back and looked at him clearly and said, "Come home safely." "That's my intention," he said. She watched him ride south until the land took him out of sight, then went inside and made herself a cup of coffee and looked at her ledger book, which had 4 months of entries showing a combined operation that was performing substantially better than either property alone had managed, and she felt both the warmth of that and the cold of the absence in the same moment, side by side, which was, she thought, probably what it felt like to be the kind of person who had let someone matter. Amos was gone for 20 days. Frank was worse than the letter had described, with injuries to his leg that had been badly set by the first person who had attended him, and Amos arranged for a proper doctor and spent 2 weeks helping Frank's wife manage the household and the animals until Frank was stable enough that the situation was under control. He sent one telegraph from the nearest station, a brief factual message that said he was well, Frank was improving, he expected to return within the week. Celia read that telegraph 4 times. Not because it contained information that required repeated analysis, but because it was his handwriting, pressed through the wire into letters on a page, and that was a form of him she could hold. He came home on a Thursday afternoon when she was in the south field checking the early planting, and she saw him coming across the flat land on the roan horse from a considerable distance, and felt something move through her entire body that was entirely outside her usual emotional management. She did not run toward him because she was not a person who ran toward things, but she walked with some purpose, and he came off the horse while it was still moving, which was slightly reckless, and crossed the remaining distance between them, and she found herself in an embrace that was completely unlike the measured, practical contact of their daily life, his arms around her with the specific quality of a person who had spent 20 days being aware of an absence and was now correcting it. "You're all right," he said into her hair. "I told you I would be," she said. "You did," he said, and did not let go for a good while, which was all right with her. Frank eventually recovered well enough to walk with a cane, though the leg would never be entirely what it had been. Amos's sister wrote twice in the following months with updates, and by summer, Frank had resumed a quieter kind of work that suited his recovering condition, which Celia noted was a practical adaptation that she respected. The spring planting was the first one they did together as a full partnership, and it was a revelation in terms of efficiency. Amos had ideas about crop rotation that Celia had not considered, and she had ideas about soil management that he had not tried, and the combination of their approaches, argued through at the kitchen table over multiple evenings with maps and calculations, produced a planting plan that was better than either of them had devised independently. Mrs. Prout who had appointed herself unofficial monitor of the Lawson Easton household's well-being, came out to the property in May with a basket of things she said were practical necessities for the coming months, which turned out to include several items that were practical necessities, and also a quilt in yellow and white that she presented to Celia with the announcement that it was for the baby, made by the quilting circle over the winter. Celia looked at the quilt, which was beautifully made and clearly represented considerable hours of cooperative effort by the women of the quilting circle, all of whom she saw at church and at community events, and who she had not realized were doing this. And she experienced a moment of unexpected feeling that she converted quickly into expressed gratitude, which was articulate and sincere. Mrs. Prout, who was nobody's fool, recognized the conversion for what it was and said, "We're fond of you, Celia, whether you make it easy or not," with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to be someone's friend regardless of the obstacle presented. Celia said, "Thank you, Eliza," which was Mrs. Prout's first name and which she had never used before, and Mrs. Prout's face did something complicated and pleased. The summer of 1883 was hot and bright, and the crops were good, better than anything Celia had seen on that land in the years she had been working it. The combined acreage under cultivation was producing a yield that put them in solid financial position, which was deeply satisfying to Celia in the specific way that things built correctly always were. She kept the books with the same meticulous attention she always had, and she showed Amos the numbers each month, and he engaged with them seriously, and sometimes had questions or observations that refined her projections in useful ways. She had come to understand with a clarity that was no longer surprising, exactly what he had appeared to be from the beginning. There was no version of him that was different in private from public, no layer of difficulty or disappointment revealed by proximity. He was steady and capable and honest, and occasionally, in the evenings when the work was done, and the day had been good, capable of a particular quietness that had warmth in it, a kind of contented peace that she found herself matching without trying, the two of them sitting on the porch as the sky went purple and gold over the plains, not needing to say anything because the day had already said everything it needed to. He told her he loved her one evening in July, not dramatically, not as a declaration, but in the same way he told her true things, quietly and factually, as they were walking back from checking the creek level after a rain. "I love you," he said. "I don't think I've said it in exactly those words." "No," she said, "you haven't. I wanted to say it in exactly those words," he said. She walked beside him for a few steps, feeling it settle into the place where all the other truths about him lived, the solid, reliable truths that had built themselves into the foundation of her life without drama or urgency. "I love you," she said. "I don't have a more practical way of putting it." "You don't need one," he said. They walked the rest of the way home in a silence that was full of every quiet thing they had ever been to each other, which was a great deal, accumulated over months of early mornings and hard work and honest conversation and shared evenings. The baby came in October. It was a long labor, managed by the doctor from Caldwell Creek, a capable woman named Dr. Helena Marsh, who had come from back east 2 years prior, and had been a source of considerable relief to the women of the county ever since. Amos spent the hours of the labor in the kitchen, which was where Dr. Marsh had confined him with firm authority, alternately drinking coffee and sitting very still with the particular stillness of a man whose entire composed exterior was under significant pressure. When Dr. Marsh came out of the bedroom and told him he had a son, he was quiet for a moment that seemed longer than it was, and then he said, "And Celia?" "Celia is tired and excellent," Dr. Marsh said, with the satisfied air of someone whose work had gone well. He stood up. "May I go in?" "Yes," she said, "go." Celia was sitting up in the bed with the baby against her chest when he came in, and she looked at him across the room with the particular expression of someone who has been through something enormous and has come through it with their fundamental self intact, which was, he thought, the most Celia thing he had ever seen her do. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was very small and very red, and had his eyes closed with an expression of concentrated importance. "He's healthy," Celia said. "Dr. Marsh says he's good." Amos reached out and put one careful finger against the baby's hand, which closed around it with the automatic authority of newborns everywhere. He felt something in his chest that he did not have words for in any language, practical or otherwise. "What do we call him?" he said. "I thought Leland," she said. "After your father, if that's acceptable." He looked at her. His father had died when he was 14, and he had not told her about him often, but he had told her some things in the evenings when the conversation went to those kinds of places, and she had listened the way she listened to everything carefully and had evidently held on to that. "Leland," he said, and it was a name that had not been spoken in a long time and sounded right coming out of his mouth in that room with that baby. "Yes, that's his name." "Leland Easton," she said, "or Leland Lawson Easton. I haven't decided which is more logical." He almost laughed, which was not the response she was expecting, and the almost laugh was so genuine that she looked at him and found him smiling in a way that reached all the way through his usual steadiness to something that was bright and completely unguarded. "Lawson Easton," she said. "It accounts for both properties." "It does," he said. "It's sensible." "Good," she said, and looked down at Leland Lawson Easton, who was still holding Amos's finger with the complete physical confidence of someone who expected the world to be solid and present. "That's settled, then." Amos stayed beside her until she fell asleep, which did not take long, and then he sat with the baby for a while as Dr. Marsh moved around the room with the quiet efficiency of medical competence. It was past midnight, and the October wind was moving around the house, and the lamplight was warm and still, and Leland had his eyes open now, dark and unfocused, taking in the light in whatever way newborns took in light. And Amos looked at him and thought about what it meant to have built something that would outlast you, which was the thing he had been working toward since he was 18, and which he had not until this moment fully understood was not about land. They moved the combined operation of both properties into a more formal shared structure in the spring of 1884, establishing a partnership agreement that Mr. Bauer drafted with the same careful precision he brought to all their legal matters, and which accounted for both individual land ownership and combined enterprise, so that the books reflected the actual structure of the thing they had built. Mr. Bauer, who had by this point visited Caldwell Creek 3 times and was clearly becoming genuinely fond of it in the way of city lawyers who discover they like space and quiet, said that it was the most clearly organized agricultural partnership agreement he had prepared in 15 years of practice, which pleased Celia in the way that professional competence being recognized always pleased her. Cal and Henry Ford had by this time become more or less permanent fixtures in the operation, hired on formal terms that included fair wages and housing in the bunkhouse that Amos had built on the Easton property during the previous summer. Cal had a gift for working with horses and took over the management of the small herd they were building, and Henry turned out to have a capacity for irrigation and water management. That meant he and Celia spent considerable time together planning the expansion of the channel system to cover the South Field as well. Leland, at 6 months, had developed strong opinions about his own schedule that he communicated with impressive volume, and Celia navigated the management of an infant with the same systematic attention she applied to any operational challenge, learning the patterns and addressing them accordingly. Amos was present for all of it, morning and night, and the middle of the night when that was required, without complaint and without the sense of performing fatherhood that some men brought to it. He simply showed up for it the same way he showed up for everything. By the summer of 1884, there was a second social at the church, at which the Caldwell Creek community noted with satisfaction that Celia Lawson had brought Amos Easton to the dancing section of the evening, and that when the fiddler struck up a waltz, she stood up from the bench where she was sitting and extended her hand to her husband with the practical intention of dancing it. He stood up immediately. He was, it turned out, a competent dancer, not showy but solid, with a good sense of time and the ability to navigate a limited space without collisions, which was the essential skill. She was better than she had given herself credit for, probably because dancing, approached with the right mental framework, was actually a coordination problem, which she was good at. Mrs. Nan Aldrich watched them from across the yard with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, as though she had arranged the whole thing, which in a certain sense she had not, and in another sense she absolutely had. "She actually looks happy," Nan said to her husband. "She's always been happy," Reverend Aldrich said, with the mildness of a man who paid attention to things. "She just used to do it in private." On the dance floor, Amos said, "I thought this was impractical." "I updated my assessment," Celia said. "What changed your mind?" he asked. She looked up at him, at the familiar face that had become the most legible and necessary landscape she knew, and said, "Better information." He smiled, the real one, the one that reached everywhere. "I'll take it," he said. They danced the whole waltz and then one more, and then Celia went and got lemonade and came back and handed him a cup, which was the mirror of what he had done 2 years ago at this same event. And they stood together in the evening light and watched the town they were part of moving around them. And the feeling in Celia's chest was something she had been building a vocabulary for all year, something that she now understood was not the opposite of practical, but was in fact the most practical truth there was. The evidence of a life managed correctly, of investment that had returned everything it promised and more. Leland walked his first steps in October, holding onto the kitchen table leg, and then releasing it with an expression of academic interest in his own ability. He made it 4 steps before sitting down abruptly, looked up at his father, who was across the room and had witnessed this, and appeared to consider the experiment complete. "He did it," Amos said, with the tone of a man who had been watching a problem solve itself. "He'll have it mastered by the end of the month," Celia said, from the pantry, where she was taking inventory. "I never doubted it," Amos said, and picked Leland up and held him with the comfortable authority of a father who had been doing this since the beginning. Leland looked at his father and made a sound that was not yet a word but had the shape of one. "What did he say?" Amos asked. "He said we should finish the South Field Channel before the ground freezes," Celia said, coming out of the pantry with a list. Amos looked at the baby. "She's probably right," he told him. The second pregnancy came in 1885, announced by Celia in the same direct Tuesday evening manner as the first. Amos received this information with the same undefended immediacy as before, and also with something additional, the ease of a person in a second known situation, less overwhelmed and more simply glad. "You're going to tell me everything is going to be fine," she said. "Everything is going to be fine," he said. "Based on what?" she said. "Based on that you've done this before and you're the most capable person I know," he said. "That's a reasonable argument," she said. "Also based on the fact that Dr. Marsh is excellent," he said, "and that we have a good house and sufficient resources and a network of competent people around us." "That's also reasonable," she said. "So between your capability and those external factors, I rate our situation quite well," he said. She looked at him. "You did all that math before I asked." "I've been doing it since about March," he said pleasantly. She blinked. "You knew since March?" "I had strong suspicions," he said. "I didn't want to say anything until you brought it up, because it seemed like your information to deliver." She studied him for a moment with the expression she used for things that surprised her, which was a certain stillness followed by recalibration. "That was very thoughtful," she said. "I have my moments," he said. The second baby was a girl, born in December of 1885 on a cold night when the snow was coming sideways against the windows, and the house was warm from the big stove and the good wood that Amos had been cutting since September. Dr. Marsh delivered her with the same capable efficiency as before, and Celia named her Ruth, which was a strong name for a small person. And Ruth Lawson Easton arrived in the world with considerably more volume than her brother had, announcing herself to the house, and presumably the surrounding land with a determination that Dr. Marsh called vigorous and Celia called characteristic, because she had already taken the measure of her daughter in the manner of a person who understood how these things worked. Leland, who was 2.5 and had recently become very verbal, was brought in to meet his sister and stood at the edge of the bed looking at her with the careful skepticism of someone encountering something unexpected in familiar territory. "Baby," he announced. "Yes," Amos said beside him, "your sister." Leland considered this. "She is loud," he said. "She is," Celia agreed. "I expect she always will be." Ruth was and continued to be. She walked earlier than Leland had, with a confident instability that indicated she was not going to let the technical difficulty of bipedal locomotion slow her down. And she spoke early and with strong preferences. And she had Celia's eyes and Amos's manner of silence when she was working something out, which she combined with Celia's manner of direct address when she had worked it out, so that the household was occasionally surprised by very small, very certain statements coming from the vicinity of the floor. By 1887, the Lawson operation was one of the more successful in the county. The combined acreage under management was producing a yield that required 3 additional workers during harvest season. The water management system had been expanded twice and was being studied by 2 neighboring operations who wanted to replicate it. And the horse breeding that Cal had developed into a proper sideline had produced several animals that had sold to the Army post and to ranches further west at prices that justified the investment. Celia had been asked twice to present at the county agricultural meeting, which she had done both times with the concise precision that those audiences found either impressive or intimidating, depending on their inclination. Amos had in 1886 built a new barn on the Lawson property to replace the original structure, which had been adequate but was not suited to the expanded operation. He had designed it himself, with the help of a carpenter from Wichita who came out for 3 weeks, and it was solid and correctly proportioned and would, Celia assessed, last 100 years if maintained. She had walked through it on the morning after the roof went on, when the structure was complete but not yet equipped, and stood in the center of it in the clean smell of new timber, and heard the way it held sound. And she thought about all the barns she had ever worked in and known, and what it meant to have one that was built exactly right. She went back to the house and found Amos at the kitchen table doing the monthly accounts, which he did now with the same facility she had always brought to them, having learned the system over years of working with her numbers, and she sat down across from him and said, "The barn is excellent." He looked up. "It's a good structure," he said. "You should be proud of it," she said. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was noting something she had said and keeping it. "I'm proud of a lot of things," he said, and went back to the accounts in a way that closed the thought and opened a space around it that she understood. She opened her own book and started on the quarterly projections, and they worked together at the table in the quiet house while outside the Kansas autumn did the things it did, going gold and specific, smelling like distance and the end of growing season, which was not an ending but a completion, the land doing what the land did, cycling through its demands and its rewards with the reliability of a system that had been running since before anyone was there to record it. In the evenings when the children were in bed, they had the house to themselves in the way that parents of young children have limited evenings to themselves, and they used those evenings with the somewhat revised priorities of people who had learned not to take quiet for granted. Chess happened less frequently. Sitting on the porch happened when the weather allowed, and conversation happened in the form that had always characterized them, substantial and undecorated, covering topics that interested them, which turned out over the years to be a wide range of things, from the mechanics of dryland farming to the political developments that came through on the telegraph to the nature of certain people. They knew to the way the light on the south field had a specific quality in November that was different from every other month. Amos had started, sometime in the previous year, the occasional practice of reading aloud in the evenings from whatever book they had access to, because the lending library in Caldwell Creek was small, but Mrs. Pruitt had taken to ordering things for it, and the supply had improved. He read without performance, in his plain, direct voice, and Celia mended or worked on whatever hand task was before her and listened, and it was a comfortable thing, the kind of thing that wove itself into the texture of a life. She had not told him that she found this particular practice extremely pleasing. She did not need to tell him. He did it because it suited both of them, and he knew it did, and she knew that he knew, and the whole thing existed in the pleasant clarity of a relationship between two people who had been paying close attention to each other for years. Frank came to visit in the summer of 1887, traveling up from the Indian Territory where he had settled permanently, walking with his cane but otherwise doing well, with a wife named Clara who was small and quick and laughed readily, and a daughter who was 4 years old and whose name was Jessie, and who immediately made friends with Ruth in the way of small, determined people recognizing each other. Leland, who was 4.5, observed Jessie with the reserve of an older child confronted with a competent younger one, and then, after about 2 hours, abandoned his reserve entirely and incorporated her into his current project, which was constructing a system of channels in the dirt of the yard that were clearly meant to simulate the irrigation system he saw his parents working on. Celia watched this from the porch with Clara, who was clearly a good person and had made Frank's life considerably more structured and purposeful, which he had needed. Frank himself had changed from the image Amos had carried back from his visit, which was of a man shaken by pain and limitation, into something more settled. He and Amos spent time together in the easy way of brothers who do not need to explain themselves, fixing things that needed fixing and talking about the work with the specific pleasure of men who like the work. "He wrote to me about you before he even told me he was courting," Frank said to Celia one evening, in the straightforward way he had, which was a family characteristic she now recognized. He wrote that he had met a woman who was the most competent person on the land he had ever seen and who had no interest in anything he might offer. "That was accurate," Celia said. "He didn't seem worried about it," Frank said. "That surprised me. I wrote back asking if he planned to do anything about it, and he wrote back that he was going to do his job well and be useful and see what happened." Celia thought about that. The fence line, the coffee at 6 in the morning, the tools and the pencil, and the way he showed up for every project without being asked twice. "That does sound like him," she said. "He was right to not be worried," Frank said. "He was," Celia said, and felt the warmth of that in her chest, the retrospective warmth of someone who can now see the full shape of a thing from a distance and recognize it for what it was. The family visit lasted a week and a half, and when Frank and Clara and Jessie departed, the house was quieter in a way that took a few days to adjust to, and Leland asked twice when Jessie was coming back with a frequency that suggested he had been more affected by the visit than his reserved initial reception had indicated. "She'll come back," Celia told him. "When?" he asked. "That's something we'll plan," she said. He seemed to find this satisfactory, which was either the influence of her approach to information or the natural disposition of a child who had grown up in a household where planning was a reliable answer to uncertainty. Ruth, who was less interested in when and more interested in the immediate, had moved on to whatever the next project was, which at the moment appeared to be a very thorough investigation of everything in the barn that she could reach, which was more than it had been a month ago because she was growing. In 1888, Caldwell Creek got its first proper school building, replacing the original single room with a 2-room structure that could handle more students and had a better stove. Celia had been one of the primary advocates for the expansion and had contributed to the building fund at a level she had calculated against the long-term economic benefit of a town with an educated population, which was a calculation she had made in her ledger book and presented to the town council with the directness they had come to expect from her. Leland started school that fall, going with the determined purpose of someone approaching a new project, and came home each evening with specific observations about what he had learned, which he delivered to both parents at dinner with the thoroughness of a report. Amos asked questions. Celia asked different questions. Leland answered both sets with the patience of a child who has grown up understanding that adults want complete information. Ruth, not yet school age, watched this with the expression of someone forming plans. The letter from Mr. Bauer came in the winter of 1888 with news that the legal professional organization in which he held membership was opening a chapter in Wichita and needed someone to lead a section, which would require him to be less available for travel. He wrote to ask if there was a good attorney in Caldwell Creek or the near vicinity who could take over their account going forward, and if not, to give him enough time to find one before he was fully committed to the new role. Celia wrote back that she appreciated his work over the years, that his handling of the Rennick matter had been excellent, and the partnership agreement he had drafted had served them well, and that she would find a suitable replacement and let him know. She also thanked him, with genuine feeling that she managed to put into the letter's final lines without making it theatrical, for the January day in 1882 when he had arrived from Wichita with his precise manner and his memory for legal precedent, and had told her the situation was manageable. Mr. Bauer wrote back saying it had been one of the more satisfying cases of his career, and that he was glad to hear the children were well, and that the Kansas agricultural reports that occasionally crossed his desk in Wichita showed numbers from their county that were, he noted, quite strong. The new attorney they found was a young man named Garrett who had just passed the bar and come west with the intention of building a practice, and who was sharp enough and honest enough to be trusted with the account, and who, over the following years, would become a reliable part of the community infrastructure in the way of good local attorneys everywhere. By 1890, Celia and Amos had been married 9 years, which was a number that Celia held in her mind sometimes as a kind of measure, the way she held the numbers in her ledger, and examined for what they showed. What they showed was a barn that would last 100 years, 300 original acres plus the adjacent Easton property, plus the 40 additional acres they had purchased in 1886, a water system that had transformed the productivity of the north and south fields, a horse operation that Cal had grown into something genuinely respectable, 2 children who were both healthy and both singular in their ways, a network of community relationships that had been built through years of showing up and contributing and being honest, and a life that was, by every practical measure she had, excellent. She was at the desk in the front room on an April evening in 1890 when Amos came in from checking the evening chores and sat down across from her, and he had that quality about him that meant he had been thinking about something. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her for a moment with the look that she now knew very well, the one that had come from him saying that forever was a practical arrangement, the look that was both steady and luminous in a way that still surprised her at intervals. "I was thinking about the fence line," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "The corner post." "You told me it needed to come out entirely," he said. "I agreed. You had it done by the next week." "We had it done," she said. "We had it done," he agreed. "And I was thinking about standing at that corner with you and you were looking at the post, and I thought, that's a person who knows how things work. That's a person who sees what's actually there." She put down her pen. "You fell in love with me over a fence post," she said. "I fell in love with you at the fence post," he said, as though there was an important distinction. The fence post was just where it happened to start. She looked at him across the desk, across 9 years of mornings and evenings and hard work and 2 children and trouble managed and harvests gathered and all the ordinary enormous substance of a life built correctly, and she felt the whole weight of it as something she would not trade for anything, not for ease or elegance or the romance she had once declared herself too practical for. "Amos," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that I know what that means now in a way I couldn't have known it before. I know what it means because I've seen what you do with it. You show up. Every day, every morning, every project. You show up." He was quiet for a moment, and the stillness in his face had that luminous quality, deep and present. "That's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. She almost smiled. "I thought I was too practical for romance." "You were," he said. "You changed your assessment." "Better information," she said. He stood up and came around the desk and offered her his hand. The same hand that had helped reset fence posts and dig irrigation channels and build a barn and hold a newborn. The hand of someone who showed up. And she took it. And he helped her to her feet. And they stood in the lamplight of the front room of the house she had built into something real. And it was not a dramatic moment. Not theatrical. Not the kind of thing a novel would have made into a culminating scene with weather and music. It was simply two people standing together in the knowledge of what they were to each other, which was everything the practical and the permanent could produce when they were in the right hands. Leland's voice came from the upstairs bedroom, calling down some question about a lesson he was working on, and Ruth's voice came from slightly further away asking something about breakfast of all things, it being 7 in the evening, which was a Ruth question, and therefore completely logical in its own terms. Celia looked at Amos. "I'll get the children," she said. "I'll make sure the lamp's right," he said. She went to the stairs and he went to the lamp, and the house held them both in its warmth. And outside, the Kansas spring was doing what it did, that particular shade of green that promised something, and this time Celia trusted it entirely, because this time she had built the promise herself, plank by plank and post by post and day by day, with the most practical and the most permanent thing she had ever had, which was the life she and Amos Easton had made together from the ground up. From the corner of a fence line to forever. Ruth was married in 1908 to a man from Newton, who was a civil engineer, and who had Ruth's measure from the first week of their acquaintance, and loved her precisely because of it, which was the only recommendation Celia required. Leland stayed on the land, bringing in a partner to help him manage the expanded operation, a young man from further north who had the same quality Amos had always had, the quality of someone who came to work and meant it, and the two of them built the Lawson Easton holding into something that the County Agricultural Board cited as a model operation for the new century. Amos turned 50 in 1903. And Celia organized a dinner for him with the same systematic attention she brought to planting plans and legal documents, inviting Frank and Clara from the territory, and Cal and Henry and Mrs. Prout, who was 72 and still behind the counter of the general store with no particular intention of retiring, and Nan and Reverend Aldrich, who had become old friends over 2 decades of community life. The evening was warm and long and full of the particular quality of people who have known each other long enough that there is no performance required, just the actual presence of people who mean something to each other. At the end of the evening, when the guests were gone and the children, now grown or nearly so, had gone to their own beds, Amos and Celia sat on the porch in the April dark with the last of the warmth from the lamp coming through the window, and the Kansas night was clear and large around them in the way it always was, immense and quiet. 50, she said. Yes, he said. How does it feel, she asked. He considered. Solid, he said. Like a good fence post. Well set. She turned to look at him, and his face in the dark was familiar as the land she had farmed for 30 years. Known in all its weather and light, and she thought about the woman she had been in 1882 who had stood at the county clerk's desk with her deed against her chest, and believed that practical was the whole of what she needed to be. She had been right, and she had also been missing something, and what she had been missing had arrived in a battered hat on a roan horse and reset a corner post, and told her that forever was the most practical arrangement there was. She reached over and took his hand in the dark, the same way she had taken it that evening in the front room, with the full knowledge of what it meant and what it had built. Good, she said. so is everything else. He turned his hand over to hold hers properly, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built into a home, in the full dark of a Kansas spring night, with the land they had made productive and the lives they had raised and the years they had accumulated in the only way years could honestly be accumulated. One day at a time, showing up, building something meant to last. The coyotes were talking somewhere to the south in the way they had always talked, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and the wheat was coming in, and Celia Lawson, who had once been too practical for romance, sat beside Amos Easton and understood, with the complete certainty she reserved for things she had proven over time, that there was nothing more practical in the world than the permanent, steady, showing-up kind of love that had made her entire life possible. Forever, it turned out, was exactly as practical as he had said.